Section 3 of Confessions of an English Opium Eater. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Confessions of an English Opium Eater by Thomas de Quincey. Section 3. So blended and intertwisted in this life are occasions of laughter and of tears, that I cannot yet recall without smiling an incident which occurred at that time, and which had nearly put a stop to the immediate execution of my plan. I had a trunk of immense weight, for besides my clothes it contained nearly all my library. The difficulty was to get this removed to a carrier's. My room was at an aerial elevation in the house, and what was worse, the staircase which communicated with this angle of the building was accessible only by a gallery which passed the head master's chamber door. I was a favourite with all the servants, and knowing that any of them would screen me and act confidentially, I communicated my embarrassment to a groom of the head master's. The groom swore he would do anything I wished, and when the time arrived, went upstairs to bring the trunk down. This I feared was beyond the strength of any one man. However, the groom was a man of Atlantean shoulders, fit to bear the weight of mightiest monarchies, and had a back as spacious as Salisbury Plain. Accordingly, he persisted in bringing down the trunk alone, whilst I stood waiting at the foot of the last flight in anxiety for the event. For some time I heard him descending with slow and firm steps, but unfortunately, from his trepidation as he drew near the dangerous quarter, within a few steps of the gallery, his foot slipped, and the mighty burden falling from his shoulders gained such increase of impetus at each step of the descent, that on reaching the bottom it trundled, or rather leaped, right across, with the noise of 20 devils, against the very bedroom door of the archididascalus. My first thought was that all was lost, and that my only chance for executing a retreat was to sacrifice my baggage. However, on reflection I determined to abide the issue. The groom was in the utmost alarm, both on his own account and on mine, but in spite of this, so irresistibly had the sense of the ludicrous in this unhappy contretemps taken possession of his fancy, that he sang out a long, loud, and canorous peal of laughter, that might have wakened the 7 sleepers. At the sound of this resonant merriment, within the very ears of insulted authority, I could not myself forbear joining in it, subdued to this not so much by the unhappy étourderie of the trunk, as by the effect it had upon the groom. We both expected, as a matter of course, that Dr. would sally out of his room, for in general, if but a mouse stirred, he sprang out like a mastiff from his kennel. Strange to say, however, on this occasion, when the noise of laughter had ceased, no sound, or rustling even, was to be heard in the bedroom. Dr. had a painful complaint, which, sometimes keeping him awake, made his sleep perhaps, when it did come, the deeper. Gathering courage from the silence, the groom hoisted his burden again, and accomplished the remainder of his descent without accident. I waited until I saw the trunk placed on a wheelbarrow and on its road to the carrier's. Then, with Providence my guide, I set off on foot, carrying a small parcel with some articles of dress under my arm, a favourite English poet in one pocket, and a small 12mo volume containing about 9 plays of Euripides in the other. It had been my intention originally to proceed to Westmoreland, both from the love I bore to that country and on other personal accounts. Accident, however, gave a different direction to my wanderings, and I bent my steps towards North Wales. After wandering about for some time in Denbighshire, Merionethshire, and Carnarvonshire, I took lodgings in a small neat house in B. Here I might have stayed with great comfort for many weeks, for provisions were cheap at B, from the scarcity of other markets for the surplus produce of a wide agricultural district. An accident, however, in which perhaps no offence was designed, drove me out to wander again. I know not whether the reader may have remarked, but I have often remarked, that the proudest class of people in England, or at any rate the class whose pride is most apparent, are the families of bishops. Noblemen and their children carry about with them, in their very titles, a sufficient notification of their rank; nay, their very names, and this applies also to the children of many untitled houses, are often to the English ear adequate exponents of high birth or descent. Sackville, Manners, Fitzroy, Paulet, Cavendish, and scores of others tell their own tale. Such persons, therefore, find everywhere a due sense of their claims already established, except among those who are ignorant of the world by virtue of their own obscurity. Not to know them argues one's self unknown. Their manners take a suitable tone and colouring, and for once that they find it necessary to impress a sense of their consequence upon others, they meet with 1,000 occasions for moderating and tempering this sense by acts of courteous condescension. With the families of bishops it is otherwise. With them it is all uphill work to make known their pretensions, for the proportion of the episcopal bench taken from noble families is not at any time very large, and the succession to these dignities is so rapid that the public ear seldom has time to become familiar with them, unless where they are connected with some literary reputation. Hence it is that the children of bishops carry about with them an austere and repulsive air, indicative of claims not generally acknowledged, a sort of noli me tangere manner, nervously apprehensive of too familiar approach, and shrinking with the sensitiveness of a gouty man from all contact with the hoi polloi. Doubtless a powerful understanding or unusual goodness of nature will preserve a man from such weakness, but in general the truth of my representation will be acknowledged. Pride, if not of deeper root in such families, appears at least more upon the surface of their manners. This spirit of manners naturally communicates itself to their domestics and other dependents. Now, my landlady had been a lady's maid or a nurse in the family of the Bishop of and had but lately married away and settled, as such people express it, for life. In a little town like B, merely to have lived in the bishop's family conferred some distinction, and my good landlady had rather more than her share of the pride I have noticed on that score. What my lord said, and what my lord did, how useful he was in Parliament! and how indispensable at Oxford, formed the daily burden of her talk. All this I bore very well, for I was too good natured to laugh in anybody's face, and I could make an ample allowance for the garrulity of an old servant. Of necessity, however, I must have appeared in her eyes very inadequately impressed with the bishop's importance, and perhaps to punish me for my indifference, or possibly by accident, she one day repeated to me a conversation in which I was indirectly a party concerned. She had been to the palace to pay her respect to the family, and dinner being over, was summoned into the dining room. In giving an account of her household economy, she happened to mention that she had let her apartments. Thereupon the good bishop, it seemed, had taken occasion to caution her as to her selection of inmates. "For," said he, "you must recollect, Betty, that this place is in the high road to the Head, so that multitudes of Irish swindlers running away from their debts into England, and of English swindlers running away from their debts to the Isle of Man, are likely to take this place in their route." This advice certainly was not without reasonable grounds, but rather fitted to be stored up for Mistress Betty's private meditations than specially reported to me. What followed, however, was somewhat worse. "Oh, my lord," answered my landlady, according to her own representation of the matter, "I really don't think this young gentleman is a swindler, because—" "You don't think me a swindler?" said I, interrupting her in a tumult of indignation. "For the future I shall spare you the trouble of thinking about it." And without delay I prepared for my departure. Some concessions the good woman seemed disposed to make, but a harsh and contemptuous expression, which I fear that I applied to the learned dignitary himself, roused her indignation in turn, and reconciliation then became impossible. I was indeed greatly irritated at the bishop's having suggested any grounds of suspicion, however remotely, against a person whom he had never seen, and I thought of letting him know my mind in Greek, which, at the same time that it would furnish some presumption that I was no swindler, would also, I hoped, compel the bishop to reply in the same language, in which case I doubted not to make it appear that if I was not so rich as his lordship, I was a far better Grecian. Calmer thoughts, however, drove this boyish design out of my mind, for I considered that the bishop was in the right to counsel an old servant, but he could not have designed that his advice should be reported to me, and that the same coarseness of mind which had led Mistress Betty to repeat the advice at all might have coloured it in a way more agreeable to her own style of thinking than to the actual expressions of the worthy bishop. I left the lodgings the very same hour, and this turned out a very unfortunate occurrence for me, because, living henceforward at inns, I was drained of my money very rapidly. In a fortnight I was reduced to short allowance, that is, I could allow myself only one meal a day. From the keen appetite produced by constant exercise and mountain air, acting on a useful stomach, I soon began to suffer greatly on this slender regimen, for the single meal which I could venture to order was coffee or tea. Even this, however, was at length withdrawn, and afterwards, so long as I remained in Wales, I subsisted either on blackberries, hips, haws, etc., or on the casual hospitalities which I now and then received in return for such little services as I had an opportunity of rendering. Sometimes I wrote letters of business for cottagers who happened to have relatives in Liverpool or in London. More often I wrote love letters to their sweethearts for young women who had lived as servants at Shrewsbury or other towns on the English border. On all such occasions I gave great satisfaction to my humble friends, and was generally treated with hospitality; and once in particular, near the village of Llanystundu, or some such name, in a sequestered part of Merionethshire, I was entertained for upwards of 3 days by a family of young people, with an affectionate and fraternal kindness that left an impression upon my heart not yet impaired. The family consisted at that time of 4 sisters and 3 brothers, all grown up, and all remarkable for elegance and delicacy of manners. So much beauty, and so much native good breeding and refinement, I do not remember to have seen before or since in any cottage, except once or twice in Westmoreland and Devonshire. They spoke English, an accomplishment not often met with so many members of one family, especially in villages remote from the high road. Here I wrote, on my first introduction, a letter about prize money for one of the brothers who had served on board an English man of war, and more privately 2 love letters for 2 of the sisters. They were both interesting looking girls, and one of uncommon loveliness. In the midst of their confusion and blushes whilst dictating, or rather giving me general instructions, it did not require any great penetration to discover that what they wished was that their letters should be as kind as was consistent with proper maidenly pride. I contrived so to temper my expressions as to reconcile the gratification of both feelings, and they were as much pleased with the way in which I had expressed their thoughts, as, in their simplicity, they were astonished at my having so readily discovered them. The reception one meets with from the women of a family generally determines the tenor of one's whole entertainment. In this case I had discharged my confidential duties as secretary so much to the general satisfaction, perhaps also amusing them with my conversation, that I was pressed to stay with a cordiality which I had little inclination to resist. I slept with the brothers, the only unoccupied bed standing in the apartment of the young women, but in all other points they treated me with a respect not usually paid to purses as light as mine, as if my scholarship were sufficient evidence that I was of gentle blood. Thus I lived with them for 3 days and a great part of a 4th, and from the undiminished kindness which they continued to show me, I believe I might have stayed with them up to this time, if their power had corresponded with their wishes. On the last morning, however, I perceived upon their countenances, as they sate at breakfast, the expression of some unpleasant communication which was at hand, and soon after one of the brothers explained to me that their parents had gone, the day before my arrival, to an annual meeting of Methodists held at Carnarvon, and with that day expected to return. He begged on the part of all the young people that I would not take it amiss. The parents returned with churlish faces, and dim Saesneg, no English, in answer to all my addresses. I saw how matters stood, and so, taking an affectionate leave of my kind and interesting young hosts, I went my way, For though they spoke warmly to their parents in my behalf, and often excused the manner of the old people by saying it was only their way, yet I easily understood that my talent for writing love letters would do as little to recommend me with two grave sexagenarian Welsh Methodists as my Greek Sapphics or Alcaics. And what had been hospitality when offered to me with the gracious courtesy of my young friends, would become charity when connected with the harsh demeanour of these old people. Certainly Mr. Shelley is right in his notions about old age. Unless powerfully counteracted by all sorts of opposite agencies, it is a miserable corrupter and blighter to the genial charities of the human heart. Section 3. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.